Hello and welcome to another episode of Political Agenda brought to you by New Narrative with me, PJ Thum. Today we're talking with Jolene Tan, who comes back for another appearance on Political Agenda to talk about her new book, After the Inquiry. But before we do that, first, I am wearing a black and white batik shirt. There's two of us sitting in front of a big map of Southeast Asia. My pronouns are he, him. Political Agenda is brought to you by New Narrative, which is a movement for democracy in Southeast Asia and which is entirely membership supported. So if you find this useful, please do join New Narrative as a member at newnarrative.com/join or donate at newnarrative.com/donate. We really need your help. And now, Subhash.
Stay where you are. We've come way too far. Where you think that you're gonna go? This is utopia. Please stay where you are. We've come way too far.
Okay, so here we are with Jolene Tan, who is author of After the Inquiry, which is a novel on censorship, propaganda, idealism, and everyday complicity and authoritarianism in Singapore. Welcome back to the show, Jolene.
Thanks for having me.
Would you like to, before we start, just briefly introduce yourself, what you're wearing, your pronouns, for our audience?
Yeah, hi, my name is Jolene Tan. I'm a fiction writer. Prior to After the Inquiry, I also had another novel called A Certain Exposure. And I've also written a children's picture book. In addition to all this, I used to be head of advocacy and research at AWARE and to run public communications there. So I've been quite active in civil society for the last few years.
Right, and that definitely informs your work.
Yeah.
Oh yes, but sorry, I interrupted you. Yes.
Sorry, description, wasn't
Yes.
it? Yeah, I'm wearing a blue dress with birds and flowers on it. My pronouns are she, her. Although I'm also a very great fan of the general singular they for all humans. So, yes.
And at the end of a very exhausting week, right, we are recording this on the 11th of March, and under a week ago, I was questioned by the police. On Monday, Terry Shi, editor-in-chief of the online Citizen Asia, had his home raided, and then he was questioned by the police on Tuesday. And then, of course, Malaysia always, doesn't want to be left behind. They have brought in Fahmi Reza to be questioned. So it's a whole week in which a lot of people who are dissidents, activists, who are information and content distributors and creators have been interrogated and questioned in Malaysia and Singapore. And so that sets the backdrop for this novel, which, oh my goodness, how do we even begin to... It's equal parts angering and aggravating, which I is in a very good way. The fact that it can evoke such emotions, right? But why don't you tell us a bit about the novel? Maybe summarize what you can, and then tell us why you wrote it. Mm-hmm. And before I go on, I should say what we're gonna do is the first about 45 minutes or so, we'll talk about the book without spoilers, and then we'll go into a spoiler discussion. So those of you who don't want the book spoiled, you can turn off when I say so. We'll put the exact timestamp in the show notes. Yeah. So go ahead, Jolene. Tell us about the book.
Okay. So After the Inquiry, I would describe as a bureaucratic whoddunit, with a touch of farce and footnotes. Many footnotes. Yes. So the essential setup is that there has been a violent incident in the police force, and there is a police sergeant who lies in a coma, and this has been determined by internal affairs to be a fairly open and shut case. There were some junior officers who were involved in some misconceived Russian roulette, and then one of them ends up in a coma. And then the novel itself is written from the perspective of a senior civil servant known as Teck, or Teck, as he generally calls himself. And it takes the form of a report that he's written because he's been asked by the ministry to go back and speak to kind of the key players in this event, even though it's an open and shut case. And he doesn't even really know why either, but he goes ahead and does it together with a younger assistant, Nithya. And so it follows the interviews that they do with various people who were involved in the incident, and it takes the form of a sort of draft report, which gradually builds to the events.
Yes,
of
the big denouement.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, because of course, it's a novel, so nothing was ever as simple as it appears at the beginning.
Oh no. Okay, so as an activist, I was just, I think, really, and I think you've had a lot of feedback similar to this, exhausted and angered by the things that we read, right? And in particular, by the character of Teck, because so much of it is so familiar to the ways in which activists are lectured at, condescended to, abused in Singapore. So before we even get into the book itself, I really need to ask, is Teck based on a real person or people? Do people like him actually exist in Singapore? And if they do, what on earth are we going to do?
Okay, so I mean, this is the question that... So I did an Instagram takeover for the publisher on the weekend, and, followers of the Instagram kind of asked me questions, and quite a few people asked, is this book fiction, or is it actually just real events, these real people? And I think the way that I would put it is this. It is informed by my experiences, and I think our experiences, what I've heard from others involved in the business of civil society, but also just, ordinary people responding to policies and politics. And I like to think that I have captured some of the spirit of those experiences and the communication surrounding these areas. But it's certainly not intended to be a kind of strictly literal, representation. As I say, I feel I've captured the spirit, but not necessarily the letter. Definitely, I think because I was involved in civil society, insofar as I have encountered public servants and office holders, I have often been a awkward and irritating presence. And so my interactions with them will reflect that. I have what I would describe as a gadfly eyes view of this. Right. I'm not going to pretend that it captures the totality of what it's like, and certainly there's no suggestion, I hope, in the book that all public service employees or officials are uniformly or homogeneously like this. But certainly these experiences of being condescended to, being hectored, being kind of almost willfully misunderstood, I think are familiar to many people.
Yes.
Yeah, and are not unfounded in reality. I think one experience that I had that really astonished me was once when I tried to suggest to some public servants that because they had communicated the rules in a confusing way, and that behind the criteria that they applied, there was another secret laxer criteria, but they wanted people to just appeal to get to that criteria. I said to them, why don't you just communicate the actual criteria up front? Because people are getting panicked when they think, for example, they have to move out of their home or something. Like, people want to obey the rules, and they actually laughed at me. They found the idea that they should communicate clearly because people were doing their good faith best to comply, to be slightly, like, amusing.
Oh my God. I just find that so infuriating, because ultimately we all want to construct a society in which we all work together for the benefit of that society, and hiding things from people does not help people to work towards the benefit. The lack of clear rules, and that's the thing. This gatekeeping of information then creates a hierarchy in which people who know how things work and actually have the information are able to use that, not just to manipulate people who don't, but whether they realize it or not, benefit themselves. And then the problem is, and this is where Teck really, I think, infuriates when you read his justifications, is that they then justify it in terms of vague things like the greater good, when it's really their good, right? In terms of the national interest, when it's really their interests. And because they have these flexible, supple minds, they can come up with all these crazy justifications when, even for things which are just blatantly wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess for our audience, they're probably sitting there a bit puzzled right now.
Yeah.
How would you describe Boon Teck?
So I guess maybe I'll try and describe it in terms of what I thought as you were saying that. I think partly the novel reflects a sort of mental journey that I think I went through as well. Growing up in the 90s, when arguably Singapore's or the PAP's political terraforming project was at its peak, right? You had got rid of the independent press, you had got rid of the pesky student movements, and you had the fresh memory of Spectrum to remind people what happened if they stepped out of line. And on the other hand, you didn't yet have blogs or independent media that was based on the internet. This was before the days of, for instance, the iconic photograph from Alex Au in the 2006 elections that showed the size of the crowd gathered at a Workers' Party rally. So you had this sort of strange space of almost like a blank slate for the PAP to impress upon people whatever they wished in terms of information. I'm not saying there weren't alternative voices, but their ability to reach people at large, I think, was extremely circumscribed. And I was sort of forming my mental picture of the world at this time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's also very little reason for me as a kind of, Anglophone, Chinese, Singaporean with upwardly mobile family and sort of a very academic temperament. There was little reason for me to be disenchanted. And so I absorbed these pictures of what the world was like,
Right.
including this view that not only was the PAP view of Singapore and politics correct, but almost that it was like morally inevitable. To disagree is objectively irrational,
Yeah.
right? So I think that it took me time to deprogram from this because I think I absorbed it very earnestly, and then I tried very hard to make everything that I encountered fit with this picture that I had been given.
Right.
But ultimately it just kind of fell apart because it's not a accurate depiction of the world. And if you inquire thoroughly and earnestly, you will find that it's not an accurate picture of the world.
Yeah.
And so I think that in a way, Boon Teck is like the propagator of this view, that there is a objectively rational way of doing governance and politics in Singapore that is accessible to the exalted few who have the brains and the temperament to access it. And I think that comes through in the way that he processes what goes on around him, and that it's also very much about not just having this view, but actively cultivating it in those around you by both persuasion, but also by other means that may be less fair.
The creating, I think he explicitly says that at one point, without, not going to explicit detail, but he explicitly thinks it about creating incentive structures around another character to control their behavior if necessary.
Yes.
And that really reflects a certain neoliberal technocratic view of the world, which the PAP still embodies, that if you just create the right structures, institutions, policies, problems will be solved. With no acknowledgement that people are, in reality, we're messy, we're human, right? We're conflicting, we have conflicting ideas. We don't act rationally, we don't act in our own interest. And our values differ and change from day to day, minute to minute, but also our values are not the values of the people in power, everyone is different. And yet it feels like he is a cog in a greater machine, and his devotion to keeping that machine going is absolute. And that's one of the things that I'm actually curious about, because for Singaporeans who are listening, especially those who've had interaction with civil service, right, this sort of picture you paint of Boon Teck about the ultimate company man, institution man, who believes in this very rationalist way, will be all too familiar. But you also seem to imply that it's also out of date in some ways, right? Because at the opening of the novel, he also acknowledges at some point, I think very early on, I don't think this is a spoiler, but that his career is kind of stuck. Mistakes have been made that he blames on the minister that he attached himself to getting voted out of power, whom I assume is an analog for George Yeo. You can tell me if it's wrong.
So I am not going to answer any questions that have to do with anybody being an analog or anyone else. It's very important to me that this is fiction, and it's not a butt covering thing. It's more that this is just going to sound quite weird, but I think although the fiction that I write definitely tries very hard to reflect my observations of the world around me, I do regard it as standing apart in its own thing. And ultimately, if you ask me why I write the book, all I can say is that I read and write entirely for my own pleasure. And part of that is accurately communicating a certain vision or spirit of the world. But I would consider it, if it's not too pretentious to say, I consider it a bit of an artistic failure if everybody mapped one-on-one onto specific people, or things that happen mapped directly into specific incidents. Okay,
so before I come back to my original question, let me explore that a bit, because I do feel some of it is a bit too on the nose, right? You had this high-flying minister who lost power. You have a certain deputy commissioner who, as a kid, wrote an email that caused a scandal, but because he's a white horse, he then rises up the ranks, and he's the son of the deputy prime minister. And that has a very specific analog in real life too.
Sure.
Right? You have researchers who talk about inequality and homelessness. And again, very specific analogs, right? And those researchers then are targeted or get in trouble, are attacked by the establishment. You've got, in the background, they talk about certain, social political sites reporting about issues, and there's just so many parallels. And I just made a bunch of notes here about some of the analogs, which I've mentioned, which I guess rather than put you on the spot, I won't say... But it's a bit too obvious.
Okay, I mean, let me kind of come back to that by saying that obviously I pay attention to the news, right? So and obviously things are more convincing or realistic in a work of fiction if they somewhat resemble things that we know around us. For instance, if you describe a place that you go to, you want to be able to accurately pick up details that give you a sense of the feel of the place, right? So I'm not going to say that I did not have anything that ever happened that was real in mind, but I guess I don't necessarily want things to be read as a direct comment on those events so much as drawing on them for inspiration. And I think if I may retreat to my other fictional precedents, right? This is this practice of dramatizing the cold face of decision making. I didn't invent it. There are plenty of bureaucratic novels or TV series that do similar things. So, for example, you have obviously the fictional civil servant without parallel would be Sir Humphrey Appleby in Yes Minister, or you have the 2000s update, The Thick of It, with Armando Iannucci. And then there you have... So Sir Humphrey Appleby was the ultimate career bureaucrat interested in maintaining his own position in a stable hierarchy. So there's a kind of underlying thesis that the United Kingdom was run not by elected representatives, but by career bureaucrats. And then you have the 2000s version, which is actually, it's neither the bureaucrats nor the representatives, but these unaccountable party spin doctors who... are continually making things up on the fly just to get headlines. Yeah. So I would also say that as I looked at events in Singapore, I saw elements of both these things as well, right? Singapore has got some of these dynamics, like the incredible growth of kind of government activity that seems to be dedicated to reputational management. I mean, things like, people are very upset when ministries posted what appeared to be very personal details of people seeking assistance.
Well, New Narrative has explicitly criticized that, yeah.
Yeah, for the sake of, seemingly for the sake of primarily of their own reputational management.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know whether data on this actually exists, but I sometimes think that Singapore must have the highest number of glossy government videos per capita in the world, like just continually inundated with these videos of like heartwarming stories of people interacting with public agencies with like, soft, gentle, emotive music. And then like last year, I think it was last year, there's definitely been a year when like the Ministry of Home Affairs PR budget was like $332 million.
What?
Just like, what is this?
332 million with, oh my god.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, it was
PR
like
budget, one
PR,
ministry.
international relations, and like kind of PR and like various other communications related things. But anyway, to draw this back, so we started with this question of like these possible real analogs. I think that I operated in the space of wanting to create convincing and relevant fiction. And so I think it's a combination of using these kind of tools and visions that I've seen in other kinds of fiction, and combining it with some sense of where things are here to kind of create what I hope is something new. Yeah.
Okay, that's I get that.
Yeah.
Right. But it feels like to me you've because maybe Singapore is so small.
Yeah.
And the parallels you use just feel a bit too on the nose, that because we live in a period where actually a lot of people are simply writing fictionalized accounts of real events as a way of commenting on those events and commenting on privilege, power, institution structures.
Yeah.
So we live in the era of The Crown, for example, whose main participants are all very much still alive and in power.
That's true.
There was Hare's play, Stuff Happens, about the Iraq War.
Yeah.
And in it, everyone was just the real people, real names. He had people playing Blair and Bush and Rumsfeld and Cheney, and he put that on stage, and it was very well received and critically very well reviewed.
Yeah.
So it kind of feels like if you're going to want to comment on certain things or certain people, we live in an era where you just go ahead and write stories which can comment on those people.
Yeah.
I suppose the only thing in Singapore is fear of getting sued, but
yeah, I mean, I don't want to discourage people from drawing the parallels if it speaks to them. I'm absolutely not going to myself say that that's what it is, in part because, and maybe this is like grandiose of me, but like I want the work to endure, right?
Right.
Like I can watch Yes Minister now without knowing all the details of 1980s British politicians. In the Loop is clearly a film about the Iraq War as well, but you can watch it and understand what it's getting at without that. And I kind of don't want the book to be legible only / primarily as an intervention in current media debates. And that's part of why I left being involved in current media debates to write a work of fiction, because I wanted to work in what I considered to be a different kind of plane, and I wanted to not have my head full of like, how is this part of this specific battle of like newspaper articles at the moment or something. I mean, it's definitely there. There's no way you can avoid it, but I guess I just don't see it as the primary identity of the book.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, rather than working at the level where you're constantly fighting every single battle and getting so deep in the weeds, that you become part of that whole environment of everything has, has spin.
Yeah.
Everything has multiple layers. You're trying to step back and work from a level of that's much more based on broader principles and values.
Yeah. So I kind of think of this book as when I think about it, for me it has a kind of miniaturized clarity. That's what it's intended to achieve. In the same way that okay, I mean, this is maybe a slightly weird parallel, but like, you know, Jane Austen novels are like 4 families meeting in drawing rooms talking. This is a limited number of people, but there's nevertheless a slice of the society that they come from. And it's the same with this book. I feel that by zooming really far in on a single incident and watching how the different actors from different institutions or different angles come into this one incident, then we can see a vision of the society more broadly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think the way that I would put it is this is not fake news so much as it's deliberate falsehood.
You're gonna say that? Aren't you gonna get yourself in trouble?
If we can't have deliberate falsehood in a work of fiction, where can we?
Oh yeah, okay, fair enough.
Can we have it?
Okay, but it comes back to the question I was asking earlier, right? And actually, we have a comment in the Discord from Olivia who says, "I don't think you can write a piece of fiction without it commentating on some aspect of the world. You can't write something that just it's hard to write something that exists in a vacuum. Even Avatar is a sort of echo fable."
Yeah, I'm totally not going to, and I hope I have not suggested that it exists in a vacuum. Merely that my desire is not to. I mean, it's not a political cartoon. Like, the characters are not meant to be direct one-for-one stand-ins of anyone. Yeah.
And you also mentioned Jane Austen, but in your was it the sort of thank you notes at the end with acknowledgements, you mentioned Mansfield Park.
Yeah.
So you're very much inspired by that sort of idea of just people talking and then a picture of a whole society emerging from those interactions.
I think in that particular reference also has something else going on there. And okay, so this also goes back to your first question about whether Teck is somebody. I mean, I think first and foremost, he's a fictional character. I mean, while some of the attitudes and behaviors that I've given him may be recognizable, he's also meant to be I would say, slightly intensely weird character of his own.
Oh yeah.
And he's partly inspired by Henry Crawford of Mansfield Park, who, for those who know Mansfield Park, there's this very weird sequence in which the families or the young people stage like a kind of home theater performance, and that is where a lot of the kind of hidden currents between people are revealed. And what's interesting about Henry Crawford is that he is a consummate actor. He can perfectly just pick up any text and play the role that is in front of him. But it is unclear to what extent when he ends up playing the role of the devoted, sincere suitor of the heroine, Fanny Price, it is quite unclear to what extent he is actually himself convinced by the role that he has taken up. Has his pretend admiration of something that is good led him to also be transformed and to himself come to approach behaving in a way that is good? So I feel that there's a bit of a similar question going on here. Some people ask me like, oh, what was it like to write a character so devoid of empathy? And I think part of my question is, I'm not sure that it's true that Teck as a character is entirely devoid of empathy. Is it perhaps more the case that if you are a sufficiently fragmented individual, that you can experience empathy, but that it may just be uselessly adrift in yourself? And does it actually translate into action when the chips are down? Yeah. So okay, this is a slight kind of literary detour, but that was also part of my thinking in going through this book. And in a sense, the other civil service character who features very prominently, Nithya, very much like Fanny Price in Mansfield Park, her main moral mode of action is simply to say no and to hold on to the core values that are supposed to be at the heart of the tradition that she has entered as a kind of semi-outsider, but where it's very questionable whether those values are still being realized there. Yeah.
Right. So are you suggesting then that Teck is also, as much as he shapes the institution, he is also shaped by his admiration and the incentive structures of the institution around him? And so, in a sense, he also, for all that he thinks and acts like he has agency, he also lacks agency.
So this is something else that I wanted to explore in the book, is the ways in which there are differing levels of agency or complicity in perpetuating injustice. And you will see it with all the different characters, that they have different relationships to the truth and different levels of interest in promoting or obscuring the truth. And this arose in part because of this experience, which I'm sure you will have observed in civil society, where, often like people there's different levels of like censorship and self-censorship, right? You have the people who will, like, even before you've told them to jump, it's not even you say jump and they say how high, they say, you want me to jump? How high? Yeah. And then you have other people who will kind of be more on the fence. Maybe they're sympathetic to certain reforms, but they don't want to come out and say so. And they were like, oh, I'll support you behind the scenes, but I'll never put my name up front. And then if things get difficult, you don't know whether they will actually stand by you or whether they'll stab you in the back to preserve themselves.
Yeah.
And then you have, like the whole kind of spectrum of, of different levels of willingness to defy authority. Now, some of this obviously is a function of how much resources anyone has, or any institution or individual has. So it's not straightforwardly about moral blame and saying that, okay, only if you are Jonathan Wham and you will go to jail for your principles, then are you a good person? Like, I absolutely wanted to avoid that. But I wanted to show the reality of the many, many different levers that can be pulled with many, many different levels of culpability and entirely human motivations.
Right.
For not speaking up against an injustice, and how we arrive at this kind of apparent consensus on silence.
Yeah.
And you see this all the time with civil society. I mean, I remember being in situations where people would be trying very hard to say, oh, we need to find a way to explain why we're doing this. And the why we're doing this would be that there had been some kind of state intervention. Some, if you suggested, like, shall we just say the truth, that the reason why we're doing this is that the state has intervened in some way, and then there's this kind of like crickets chirping, and people just cannot contemplate engaging in that confrontation. And I believe very much that this is a very nuanced situation. Different people can afford to take on different levels of confrontation, but the way that we almost, many people sort of reflexively refuse to even consider it, I think has trapped us.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's part of what I wanted to explore in this book as well.
And it's not just really about people in the civil service, right? Although, of course, that there is sort of, as you've painted, a sort of everyday complicity, and you do have choices at all levels, and resistance doesn't have to be one way, or acting morally doesn't have to be in a very specific way. But it's our entire society as a whole, and the kind of choices that we make on a daily basis about the things that we say or do, even just the choice of what to like or not like on Facebook or share on social media, but also just the things that we say to people, and the when I was first starting out in this whole field, the sort of, oh, now is not the right time, or is there a smarter way of doing it, right? So even that, and motivated out of concern for good intentions, also then ends up supporting the injustice that is being perpetuated by the current system.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the one thing that really struck me was, and I quoted part of his book in the epigraph of this novel, Peter Pomerantsev, in his book Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which is an account of his experiences in post-Soviet Russia. His family fled the Soviet Union, and then he went back afterwards. He talks about how there was a society where people would all just have no fixed identity, and so they would go home and listen to opposition radio, but then they would go out later and pay tribute to the president in public. And they would say, it's not that I'm a bad person, I'm just playing the game. This is how the game is played. This is how you do things in the smart way.
Right.
This is how you survive. And I was very interested in this notion of fragmented individuality and a fragmented consciousness that allows you to take on all these different roles. So there's the play acting thing again. That will allow this wider structure to survive, even though people have their kind of secret liberal hearts or their secret sympathies. In a sense, all of these things can coexist, but if you don't act, the outcome is the same as if you had no sympathies at all. Yeah.
And in some ways, and this again coming back to the character of Teck, seems like he may have started out being different, but he has been shaped by his choice to play this game and become the consummate player of the game, and that has become who he is. But if he had made different choices, he would be a very different person.
Yeah, and I think it's true. I mean, it's true of everybody, right? And so, again, obviously he's the main character, but as I said, I wanted to also depict different stakes and different attitudes and approaches in the whole range of characters as well. I mean, I think that for me, the thing that maybe this is stepping away from the book for a moment. Actually, the only way to square the circle, I think, is if we recognize that actually the only game that will get us where we need to be in the long run is solidarity with other people, and that if we keep trying to play the game in like our individual silos, then then we get played lah.
Yeah.
Because it will always, as long as the powerful people hold the cards, it will always be in each of our individual self-interest to knife one another to get whatever they are handing out today. And then as long as we remain weak, then they can always choose what to hand out. Yeah.
I remember, starting when I was first publishing about Cold Store, about using all the declassified documents, and people were asking, well, are there more declassified documents? And I was like, well, the Singapore government doesn't declassify documents. And someone actually asked me, well, what if, right, you join the government and you be a loyal soldier for 10, 20 years and you work your way in to the point where you have access to these documents, and then you can find these documents and release them. And I was like, are you joking? I mean, I understand what you're trying to say, but like that means you'll have spent 20 years perpetuating the government and working for its benefit, all to get the documents, so you'll have done all this for what? For one set of documents, right? If you want to fight authoritarianism, fight authoritarianism. Otherwise, you're complicit in authoritarianism, and what you're suggesting will actually mean that all your efforts will be to support the system, except for this one act and 20 years down the road, who on earth knows how you think? Because I certainly am very different from how I was 20 years ago.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think the reality of living and operating in this society is that it's very hard to ever not be complicit.
Yeah.
But I think for me, what's important is that we recognize our individual acts of complicity for what they are, rather than trying to pretend that it's all part of some grand game where actually we're winning.
Yeah.
I think that if we, if people say, I'm at this point not willing to trade this to achieve that goal, that's fine. And different people have different circumstances, different people have different thresholds. What I think we shouldn't do is lie to ourselves about it. Yeah.
Self-awareness. Yeah. And, also less like people be like feel frustrated. I also want to remind us that it's a two-sided, coin or whatever, that you're complicit, but you can also resist every day in different ways, right? And I've talked about James C. Scott, Weapons of the Weak, Ways to Resist, which may not seem overtly like resistance, but are forms of everyday resistance. And, James C. Scott's work is actually very relevant to Singapore, even though a lot of it is based on Malaysia or whatever. So I want to come back to my question earlier then, because I'm assuming the whole book is a critique of how Boon Teck thinks. But it also seems like implicitly, because at the opening of the book, his career has kind of come to a halt, right? And that's why we started by mentioning the minister who was voted out unexpectedly. He's, for all his talents, he's come to a sort of plateau, a standstill, right? His meteoric rise has halted. But also you have talked about this being born out of a certain formative experience of the 90s. And Boon Teck seems to reflect this, the 90s, in the sense that there was this idea then that at the height of neoliberalism, that if we just get the incentive structures right, which the PAP still believes in, but today such a person can't succeed in Singapore. And I think leading politicians also recognize that and are responding and changing to that, and looking at members of the fourth generation of PAP leadership and other politicians. They recognize that circumstances have changed. So both in how you describe the formative experience of this book, but also how you situate Boon Teck within, and his career and its sort of lack of ascension, it seems to imply that he's a bit of a dinosaur. Now, was that intentional, or is this maybe just a reflection of how this book arises out of a certain time period, which is no longer totally, or the values of that time period are increasingly no longer, accepted and less relevant today?
That's very interesting. I'm not sure that I had thought about it that way. I can definitely see how that works in the book. But I guess you can tell from my sort of being struck by what you're saying that it's not an angle that I had thought about so explicitly before. But I can definitely see how that works. I mean, I think there is definitely a sense in which the book is possibly contains some anachronisms. Like, I'm not sure that I necessarily reflect the way that young people are, or like a critical young person would be. I think perhaps in a way Nithya may also be a bit of a 90s throwback in some respects, or at least maybe a 2000s throwback. No, I didn't think about that specific kind of. I guess as a historian, you would look at it in terms of errors. That's quite natural.
I guess so.
But I hadn't actually kind of had that thought.
Well, we're both like of a certain age. I mean, okay, I'll say I'm 41, right? And we both had very formative experience where we were in our teens in the 90s, and it really shaped us. And maybe
which is what this is all about, by the way.
Okay.
Anyway.
Check out her earlier book, A Certain Exposure. But Boon Teck is also, how old is he? It's not made
There's
clear,
a
I
point
think.
when he's talking about Hafiz is the man in the coma, and he's
Mhm.
talking about Hafiz's mum, who is, I believe, in her late 50s. The only clue we have to his age, as to his age, is at that point, where at the very beginning of that chapter we see that she is.
Sorry, go ahead.
She's in her late 50s.
Right.
And then shortly afterwards, he says that they are in some sense of a similar cohort, although he is maybe 8 or 9 years younger than her.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Right,
he's
right.
he's on verging on the 50s.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course he was well, actually I don't know if that's a spoiler, so I won't finish what I was gonna say. But what was your intention then with depicting Boon Teck as someone whose career has stalled in spite of his incredible talents and devotion to the machine, rather than someone who is still rising significantly?
I mean, how does one describe this without any spoilers? I mean, he has certain he does have certain incentives to act in particular ways. Partly as a result of this desire to be further along than he is, right? So that influences.
Maybe we'll come back to this in the spoiler section.
Yeah.
But let me just, I had a few more questions from a non-spoiler perspective. And one was about the framing, right? Because you frame it as a report, but then also there's all this personal detail, which you then, he footnotes as saying, well, his mental state is important. Yeah. But it ends up kind of feeling like he, a bit neither here nor there, in the sense of you have a report and some of it explicitly goes into transcript, right?
Yeah.
And then you have descriptions of things that would in no way be included. Yeah. For example, there's a lunch with a group of, young scholarship holders.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about why you framed it this way and how you ended up framing it that way and the choices you made there?
So the kind of seed crystal for the whole book came when I was reading Teo Yu Yen's This Is What Inequality Looks Like. And so I was sitting there in this kind of in-between time, waiting for a meeting to start and reading the book. And the book has footnotes and the book has endnotes, and I was flipping back and forth. And then all at once I was like, I'm going to write a book with lots of footnotes. And it will be about an ambitious bureaucrat who trades in a kind of specious facticity in which the appearance of correctness and rationality are central to his understanding of the world and of himself. But in fact, something else is going on. Because I think it was the line in her book where she says, once we see, we must not unsee. And just actually, I've always thought of that line as the basis for the book, but I went back to that passage a few days ago, and I realized that even above that, she had said that it was about looking at empirical evidence from a new angle to question our narratives, and that it was both the book was both an external as well as an internal dialogue. And so all of these things then informed my vision for this book. So part of what I am interested in is this whole notion of the creation of narratives and the creation of myths, and how what we see as truth becomes truth, and how lies become the official truth. And so for me, the various the footnotes are there to give and the report format give the atmosphere or the tone of a very forensic and rational investigation. But clearly this person, psychologically, there's a lot of other things going on, and what we are actually seeing is the result of something much more chaotically human, even though it is presented with all this veneer of kind of documentation and correctness. And so that's kind of what is going on there. And I also just was very interested in this idea of a confusing and unsympathetic narrator as our window into the truth. Because I guess on a technical level, I was quite attracted by this challenge that by definition, we can only see what he sees.
Yeah.
And yet we must see more than he sees. And I saw that also as a way of us reading or piercing myths in the world around us. Yeah.
Right. Okay. That's really fascinating. As a historian, I really appreciate that approach. And as to a certain, trying to both tell a story, but also critique how stories are made.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I that hadn't occurred to me, but that is actually a really interesting and definitely I fully endorse this the importance of understanding that narratives are not there is no absolute truth, right? And narratives are constructed and they're negotiated.
Which
they're
is why
arguable.
sometimes we need a new
Yes, a
narrative.
new narrative. Yeah. Which is part of what we're trying to do at New Narrative and what I try to do in my work. So yeah, okay. But it's, I suppose it's never really made explicit. So it's something you're challenging the reader to think about and consider as they read and think about and construct, and as they read the story.
Yeah, they are also engaged in this inquiry and trying to puzzle out what the truth is.
I was actually worried halfway through that it was an unreliable narrator because I was feeling like, I suspected either things were being left out or he was misrepresenting things. But then it turned out he wasn't. Is that a spoiler? I suppose.
I don't know. I mean, there's a sense in which he's unreliable.
Yeah. I suppose we've come to about 50 minutes in, so
Okay.
I suppose we can get to the
spoilers.
spoilerish bit.
Okay, if you don't watch further if you don't want to be spoiled.
Yeah.
And it's a very kind of it's a whodunit. So I would recommend not spoiling yourself.
Yeah, I definitely. So for those of you who are stopping here, the book is After the Inquiry, and I really recommend that you get your own copy and you read it, and definitely stick with it, because the character of Teck, if you have, in my opinion, right, if you have any sort of moral compass to you, you're going to find him infuriating. But that's the skill with which he's written, and if you stick with him, then if you stick with the book, you will be very much rewarded. It's very thought-provoking and highly recommended. Okay, so we're going to come back with the spoilerish section in a second. But for those of you departing now, After the Inquiry is available at all bookshops and at Ethos Books online. Thank you. Okay, so spoilers. Okay. So what were you going to say earlier? We were talking about the character of Boonthig and...
Oh, and like why he is stalled.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because he has stalled because he hasn't played the game of politics in addition in the way that enables him to advance, in addition to kind of faithfully doing the job that's on paper, right? Although even the parameters of that job are a bit dodgy. So
he seems to justify it to himself, though, because so the fall of his first minister was out of his control.
Yeah.
But then he attaches himself to Simon Pereira, who seems to be as they say, a very solid minister of state, no higher.
Yeah.
And then he justifies that to himself as well. I'm happy at this level.
Yeah, I mean, but you can tell that he's not really, right? So like when there's clearly some kind of I think there are signs of resentment or signs of frustration And then there is the whole sequence where he encounters his new patron. And
Benedict Yeoh.
yes, and he sees the opportunity there, and he realizes that unless he hitches himself to a brighter star, he's not going to advance. So that is a I suppose a comment on the world that he lives in, as well as his own motivations. Yeah.
And I mean, that whole encounter with Yeoh was interesting to me because there are sort of two separate encounters with Yeoh, which are detailed. One is the sort of face-to-face, the fifth, was it? The last interview, right?
Yeah, the fifth interview.
Fifth interview.
Yeah.
And then another is his recollection of how he meets Yeoh as a young person younger person, who's about 10, 11, 12 years younger, who has now left the private sector, and it's later revealed amidst rumors of incompetence, and is now wanting to join his ministry. And he's saying, basically to this kid, basically, you failed and you want to join us now, why should we take you? Yeah. And
I think if you were looking for the scant evidence of some moral compass, there is some there, right? Like this is the point at which he actually stands for something which is his own notion of meritocracy.
Yeah. So this flashback, shows he seems to be different back then, right? That's one of the things that struck me. And then he's kind of changed a lot, and he's stalled out. But then he meets Benedict Yeoh again, and what really struck me there was the renegotiation of their relative circumstances, and how he explicitly says, Benedict Yeoh wants to make clear the distinction between us, that who is in charge has changed. Which, I mean, first of all, I wasn't sure who's more senior, a deputy commissioner or a senior civil servant in the ministry that oversees the police. But another thing, it really strikes me that, there was this study years ago that showed how hierarchical Singapore was. It was a survey of like all these different countries on earth, and Singapore was one of the top in terms of hierarchy. And we have to negotiate that all the time, every day, and that really permeates the book. Hierarchy in all sorts of ways. And I find it, in some ways, I've got so much sympathy for NSF Lee. Is that his name? Lee?
That's right.
Because he's in his own way, trying to raise problems, attention to problems. But because he's on that lower rank of the hierarchy, he's seen
it just precipitates disaster.
Yes. And that really precipitates the whole situation of the book. So is hierarchy one of the big themes that you were explicitly?
Absolutely. Like it is, like I said earlier, like this different levels of complicity are of interest to me, and I think hierarchy plays a very large role in that in Singapore. I was also actually specifically as a subject matter, and I won't pretend that this is in any way a book that deals with it really. I have for some time been troubled by these news stories that reveal the vulnerability of NSFs. In particular, there's the SCDF Corporal Kok Yuan Chin who drowned. And then Corporal First Class Dave Lee, the very widely known story of heat stroke. And so I think that it was too large a subject to address in detail, but I did want to, it kind of did affect my thinking about plot, and it sort of was some of the starting point for thinking about this NSF character.
And is it also, I mean, I remember you've remarked on this in the past, a comment sort of on the militarization of our society as a whole, and the creation of a mindset among all men of a certain, need for unquestioning obedience and the use of violence as a solution, and that being imposed on all men in Singapore because of that 2 years of brainwashing. I mean, was that also, did that also affect
Yeah,
your
I mean, I
thinking?
guess I did not write about the military. I decided that for the purposes of the dramatic structure of this book, it made more sense for it to be set in the police force rather than in the military. But definitely the sort of... So I interviewed actually several cops before I started working, because I was like, this is... I have only ever interfaced with the police on a completely different side of things, right? So it's things like what do they call each other?
Yeah.
Do they say sir and ma'am, or do they say title, for example? And then I found out, okay, actually they say the title. So things like that. But what was interesting to me was that kind of unprompted, this theme of hierarchy also emerged somewhat in these conversations. And I think that it's very telling the way that everybody responds to this NSF is with this utter kind of dismissal in many ways, even though he's actually quite a savvy and in some ways brave character in this book. So I was interested in that, in like a kind of the way that these hierarchies of masculinity squash certain people.
I want to congratulate you actually, because like I feel that you have captured how men in the military, in national service rather, and how our experience of it very well. Obviously you've not gone through it, but it's a testament to your skill that you actually, when I read it, I found it thoroughly familiar with my own experience. It was just very familiar to me when I looked at how they treated each other, the things they said to each other, the kind of hierarchy they imposed, the plausibility of both the cover-up story and what then actually really happens, right? All of this is just so painfully familiar. And for me personally, I've gotten in trouble so much in my life because I've been in positions like what NSF Lee, Sergeant Lee, is doing, tried to do, bring up certain questions. And just not even, it wasn't even higher ups getting angry with me, right? That I kind of expected. It's like your peers getting angry with you, saying, why are you extending the meeting? Why are you causing trouble? Why are you making the rest of us look bad? Why are you rocking the boat? And it's just so frustrating when you're just trying to do the right thing and trying to raise an issue of importance, and instead you're shot down. But you also had, or rather, someone recounted, whether it actually happened or not, but in the book, some of the women officers came and told him off. Is that also meant to be a reflection of, was it meant to be something that was made up by the superior officer, or was it something you intended in the book to actually happen? And is that also your observation of the complicity of minorities in their own oppression?
So it's actually a anecdote recited by another NSF. So it's not made up. He is a complete, like, kind of straight talking sort of character. So yes, it is meant to have actually happened, and maybe not necessarily focused on minorities, but I think that it was intended to indicate the difficulty sometimes of being somebody who has a vision for a certain kind of change that you believe will benefit the people around you, but that convincing them of that and getting them to be on board with you on that can be very difficult, especially when the structures of hierarchy are focused on the fact that you are a troublemaker, that you're extending the meeting, that you're making things difficult, so on and so forth. And that, I guess it was a depiction of one of the obstacles to solidarity building. But I'm glad that it resonated with you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I thought, all of that was captured very, very accurately. I don't know how, say, younger people or people who are going through NS right now will respond to it. But definitely I felt the characters that you painted and how they behaved were very accurately reflective of my own experience.
Right.
Yeah.
But you were a military.
Yeah, I was
And, right.
military, yes.
Mm.
Yeah. But, there's a certain male behavior in national service, right? I think which is, I would hazard is, and a certain demand for conformity and, all of that, which is expected and which I very much experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And then which extended itself into the non-NS world
Right. Yeah.
in Singapore.
Yeah.
So there's certain anecdotes which happen, and I'm interested in like your choice of anecdotes and how you inserted them,
Okay.
right? And there's three in particular. One is what happens to Nithya's father, and that sets up this whole what he says to her at the end.
Yeah.
But it also kind of shows he has this shred of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And then he describes it as a feeling of nausea. And I mean, is that at that point, that was one of the things that kind of took me a bit out of the immersion, because I'm like, it feels too you've created him to be too much of a monster.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But like, you actually repeat then that this at the end where he has this odd feeling at the end.
Yeah.
So nausea is the one at the end.
Yeah.
He has some odd feeling in his stomach
Yeah.
when he helps her, which is meant to be like good feelings, but he finds it weird.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end, after he basically tears her apart, he has this feeling and watches her walk away, this feeling of nausea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but why do it that way? Was that like a conscious choice to have him actually be so disengaged from his own feelings that he couldn't even acknowledge them?
Okay, this is the spoiler version, so I can say, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, it's partly a comment on his own kind of disconnect from himself and his lack of emotional awareness. I am generally very interested in emotional repression, and I wanted to show that this was a person who had his ideological commitments and his practical ambitions, but who also had other more positive longings for connection, for esteem, for admiration, and also for affection for the people around him. But that to pursue those ideological and practical ambitions requires you to squash those more vulnerable parts of yourself. So that is partly what's going on there. There is actually a part at the end where he does have enough emotional literacy to actually name his feelings. But the point is that against the structures and the systems that he has kind of committed himself to, these can only ever be fleeting. And I do think that the nature of sort of support for authoritarianism is that it does require you to suppress your emotional connection to and the recognition of people in your life who may fall outside of the norm or fall, into a blacklist or get into trouble. And I think I have seen this in the way that people. I mean, I don't know I don't know whether it's something that you have experienced, but I have definitely had peers from my past distance themselves quite clearly because I am a awkward person to be around for political reasons, for example.
Yes, yeah, definitely I've experienced that, yeah.
So there's also some of that going on that, I mean, not to be all like, oh, poor him, boo-hoo, but there is a human cost to him as well. Yeah. Right.
It just, that was just those points where I just felt like, and maybe it's because it's me, and I try and, I'm an activist for so you don't choose to be an activist unless you see the world in a certain way and think in a certain way.
Yeah.
But what he was thinking and doing felt so alien. His choices felt so alien to me. That's why I started this whole interview with, does this person actually exist? Because I found it very hard to believe that he could exist. But then I thought, if he really does exist, then, you know, we are much more screwed than we assumed if this is the kind of person who's actually in government.
Yeah, I
in
mean,
civil service.
The book is in some ways also just a character study of an intensely strange person, right? Which is also a kind of fiction that I enjoy a lot. So, you know, for instance, Ishiguro's Artist of the Floating World also has a kind of repugnant narrator who has been engaged in certain ethically dubious activities.
No, I haven't that one, but Ishiguro, you know, like really fantastical stuff happens in his books. You don't actually feel like this is, because this is on the one hand so ultra realistic,
right,
and then on the other, it scares you that it could be real, right, and you're walking this line where I'm like, this is so familiar, this is so real, I could see this happening, but then you have this guy who's so scary. I'm like, is this really how people think? Do these people really exist? And I think that's why you've had some of the responses you've had, because why it's so terrifying to read this book.
Yeah, so this is interesting because a lot of people did say, like, I don't know whether this happened, but I think one of the reviewers said, I don't know whether this happened, but it could. And that is the question that bothers me and keeps me thinking about it. And I think, I hope that there's been a kind of balance between the kind of realistic seeming setting and this very intensely weird person that hopefully comes together as a whole. But I guess, you know, maybe some people have more of the feeling that, I've been taken out of it at this point. But I guess my aim was to try and to make these two things fit.
Yeah. I mean, if the aim of good fiction is to really make us question ourselves, our assumptions, think about ourselves, think about the world around us, then definitely you've succeeded, you know, very well. And the kind of emotional reactions you've gotten to this, right? I mean... and
I wanted to add that somebody in a review that I read today asked, a lot of people, you know, obviously had very like negative reactions, like to the character of Teck. But there was somebody who said, I got me thinking about, are we Buntex? Are we all Buntex? And then I was also quite pleased to see that question come up as well, because that is also one of the purposes of having him be the narrator, is that we have to go through this journey and see perhaps that in ourselves.
Right. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good point. I guess if you... at no point did I feel sympathy for him is the problem. And I wonder if this book would be so much worse if I actually read it and felt sympathetic. He seems to apply the logic of neoliberalism and technocracy to even his own personal life. Because that little scene you wrote where his father had to go for a health checkup, and he's like, I have to work, get the maid, the domestic worker to do. I think he used the word maid. And then he basically, the way it seemed like he was applying this ruthless logic that, look, my time is worth so much. We're paying a professional to look after my dad. The professional should do it. The trade-off between not being able to communicate as well and me not being able to do my work is too great. So let the professional do it, right? And that's a ruthlessly, neoliberal logic to apply to your own father. But he applies that as well. Yeah,
I mean, I would say that I have encountered ruthlessly neoliberal people. Yikes. I think,
okay.
And I think, to add to that, that is another facet of Singapore that I didn't explore in huge detail, but I did want to gesture at several points in the book, is the way that we systematically undervalue care.
Yes.
And that every time he has to encounter children, or in this case his own father, and people who require care, there's a kind of like distaste or disturbance in him that you can see emerging in the footnotes. So that was also a note that I wanted to strike.
Or when he talks about his friends' children and how they finally reach the age where it's no longer awkward to talk about them.
Yes, because he can talk about careers and universities. Yeah.
Because they're productive members of society now, right?
Yeah.
Oh my God, there's a lot of layers here that now that I'm thinking about it, but it's just also familiar and So another sort of scene or a set piece that stood out to me that I'm interested in is that whole conversation, the sort of random lunch with Shu Yan and Sophia. And I mean, the number of times when I was young where I had some sort of civil servant condescendingly tell me that I was too idealistic, I just you just get so angry because engage with the ideas, right? Don't insult me. But did you have a certain idea in mind in writing that scene? Was that more to expand on him as a person and his ideas and show how they applied and also show how the system was going to shape these young people? Or did you have some?
Yeah, I mean, there's this continuing theme, even from the very beginning when he first kind of describes Nithya. He's talking about how to propagate like kind of his ethos, right? So I think that was another example of that happening. And just as you identified that in the case of NSF Lee, he was then attacked by some of the people he was trying to advocate for, you also see in this scene that it's not just Teck doing his thing on the idealistic young person, but in fact encouraging this kind of pincer attack from her peers as well. And then at the end offering the kind of incentive of advancement as the kind of salve. So I was very interested in this propagation of these mindsets. And there's an extent to which I think back sometimes to arguments that I had with peers as a young person, in which I sometimes perhaps uncharitably look back and think I was trying to figure out what I thought, and that's why I argued with you so intensely about it. But on hindsight, I wonder, were you also trying to figure out what you thought, or was this a dress rehearsal for defending whatever the status quo was? And I am probably being uncharitable when I have those thoughts, but there's this doubt sometimes that I have. And that was a something that I was also kind of addressing in this. It's like the weapons of fancy academic speak or like intellectual arguments. And I don't want to come across as anti-intellectual here. I love reasoning and logic and argumentation. But that was a case of them, that was a depiction of these tools being basically misapplied. Because if you don't see what's really going on, which is that it's about them earning their place in the reward structure and not about the actual engagement on the issue, then you may miss that that the intellectual argument is not about the intellectual substance.
Yeah. And well, actually, that kind of brings me to, in some ways, the overall ending, right? Because what ends up happening is that if you read it one way, he is completely and utterly betraying what he's supposed to be standing for, because he deliberately deletes the files. He suppresses the real story, and he breaks the law, right? Even though he spent so much time extolling how important it is to do things the right way. But if you read it the other way, that his loyalty is to a bigger idea of the system, right? And he explicitly says, we don't need people questioning the police, we don't need to undermine confidence in the police, and he justifies it through this whole bigger picture. He is actually being very true to the things that he believes in. But there's no sense of awareness in him that he is in some ways being extremely hypocritical. And is he really lacks a lot of self-awareness, I guess, which is his biggest problem. He thinks he has self-awareness, but he does things which openly contradict himself without stopping to really think about it. But he just can, because he can justify them, right? And maybe he's been doing so since that young age, making these arguments. They flow so smoothly out of him. And it ends up, so basically you have this ending where, is he even aware of what he's doing, of how he's breaking the law? You're not even sure, right? And so at the end of the day, how smart or insightful or intelligent or self-aware is he really? So I don't think I really have a point there, but that's what I was observing. I was like, as I was reading it, I was like, are you really conscious of what you're doing?
So this is again ties back to what I was very interested in, with like kind of people being fragmented in parts, and you're right, like you are all these things that are contradictions, but you don't even see the contradictions anymore. And I was definitely very interested in that as within the rubric of this very factual document, or within the trappings of a factual document.
And then of course he's rewarded for it, right? Once he tells Benedict Yeoh what he's done, and Benedict Yeoh understands, this person, he fixed things for me. He's a fixer. He gets things done. I need him. I reward him.
And even the other guy gets rewarded with there's the hint that he may also be brought on board, even though he's Jonathan Chua, even though he's the perpetrator of terrible things. There's a hint. There's a part where Teck says, his skills might actually, once he realized there's a problem, he actually did quite a good job. His skills could be useful.
Right. Yes. But even though he created the problem to begin with, right? I mean, that guy was, and how he was. That's another thing about the ending. How he was supposedly punished, right, by having his promotion withheld. I mean, oh my God, we've heard that line so many times now, and that was infuriating. And then this possibility, not even confirmed, that some welfare may be channeled to Hafiz's family, right? And that's how the system solves things, right, without rocking the boat. I mean, it was so, just viscerally infuriating to know, but again, right, the Boon Teck doesn't seem to have any conscious understanding that this is undermining everything that he supposedly espouses, right?
But I also think this kind of slightly nihilistic, chaotic thing is a enduring feature of many authoritarian settings, and that's partly what I wanted to capture as well. Like for instance, everybody strenuously denies officially, back when streaming was under attack, everybody would strenuously deny that streaming was bad for students or that it contributed to inequality. And then suddenly the minister announced that streaming was going to be done away with. And then on everybody just 180 degrees, experts say that this is long overdue. I mean, this the connection, if you have to always toe the party line without any room for doubt, then your relationship to reality becomes extremely tenuous, and that's kind of part of what informs the atmosphere here as well.
Oh boy. So before we get to my last question, which could be a bit related to that, I actually had one more observation that I just remembered, which is how you also brought out a lot of the social cultural markers of status in Singapore, and in a way that some of which were very unconscious to me, but you brought them out and foregrounded them because Boon Teck was
obsessed with
and I think we all like subconsciously have absorbed these, right? How you speak, how you look, how you dress, how you act, and of course the ultimate, the closer you are to emulating a certain ideal, the better, right? That ideal probably being Lee Kuan Yew himself or something like that. Yeah, like being able to speak with those tones and with that knowledge and action. But again, right? That was deliberate, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
And have you thought about like actually writing a book about how we look at each other? Because I think that would also be fascinating, because that's one of the things, looking through someone's eyes, right, at how he looks at other Singaporeans, and realizing in some ways, hey, yeah, I look at people that way too, because that's how we categorize people in Singapore. That itself was something I thought worth exploring entirely in and of itself.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, that's interesting, because I think that has been a enduring issue in my the fiction that I've written so far. Both these novels and another short story I've written. I think I struggle with it slightly because I mean, okay, you can hear from the way that I speak that, I tend to speak in a certain register, and left to my own devices, I would, like, if I was writing for myself, I would write in a certain register, which I also realize is very much at odds with what we would normally hear if you just stop the Singaporean on the street and talk to them, right? Like, you might hear something like this, but chances are you probably won't. So I think I am always very conscious of how these different languages within the language interact, and how to make that work in a way that is true to what our society is like, but also indulges my own aesthetic desire to write in a certain way. And so I think I have resolved this problem in different ways in the different works that I've written, but it is something that I'm very aware of. So I guess I don't know, perhaps another work that looks at it more squarely would be. I mean,
if Jane Austen is someone who inspires you, right? And that's, there's so much about social class. I think it'd be really cool to do something which really draws out all these differences, all these social class markers that we don't think about, and it would be really revealing. Especially, there's a tendency for tiny crowded islands or communities which are very to develop a lot of markers of a lot of unwritten, unsaid language where we use to signal each other quickly, right? You see in Japan, you see in the UK, right? These are crowded island nations, and we are one too, and we have developed this whole language that's unwritten, but it'd be great if someone could really explore it.
No, that's very interesting. Yeah, okay, I will think about it. Yes, perhaps it will make its way into something else.
Okay, so I guess just the last question is really about where you want to go with this novel. Usually when we have these podcasts, we end with, asking people about their theory of change. But, what kind of impact do you hope, or rather, I guess, more broadly, theory of change, like, is writing these books part of how you want to create change in society? And what do you hope to achieve with these books, and what do you want to do, with these books? Where do you want to go with this in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a level on which it's all like extremely decadent, and like I said, I read and write for my own pleasure, and I want the books to be read because I think it will bring other people a certain kind of pleasure. Even the pleasure seems to also involve being very angry. In a way, I see fiction as being part of a very long-term conversation that can communicate certain visions of both kind of these different structures in society, as well as that human experience of inhabiting them, in a way that I feel is not available with such intensity in other media, or at least I don't feel that I can work in other media in that way. So I see this as a contribution to this continuing question of who we are what we look like to ourselves and what we want to look like to ourselves, or where we want to go. So I don't think it's like anything as direct as, I used to write like policy reports when I was working at Aware. There's not that straight linear equation. We write this policy report because we want this particular law changed or this particular policy changed. But I guess if it can get people thinking about these various themes of how truths are constructed and how power propagates itself, then I think it will hopefully have done its job. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, well, thank you very much, Jolene. Thanks for stopping by on our podcast and giving us so much of your time to talk about this book.
No, thank you for reading it so closely and offering so many interesting comments.
Yeah, well, I think I can't help where if I really read a book, I end up reading it in a kind of academic way where you end up like questioning everything.
Yeah.
So it's also a real pleasure to be able to talk to an author about their authorial intent and what they're trying to do, and also because of the broader social-political context in which this book is situated, right? It's been a lens for us to talk about a lot of different issues in Singapore, which I really enjoyed, really appreciated.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it too. Thank you for having me.
Okay, and as always, thank you to our members on Discord who have attended, commented, asked questions. I really appreciate all of you being there. And if you'd like to join as a member, please go to newnarrative.com/join, or if you'd like to donate, please go to newnarrative.com/donate. If you're a member, you get to watch these things live and take part in our Discord, and you also support New Narrative, which, as I mentioned, is entirely dependent on membership revenue. So with that, thank you to all of you who are listening or watching. The book is After the Inquiry by Jolene Tan. Go buy it now. Go read it. Really good. Very thought-provoking. And we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.
Stay where you are. We've come way too far. Where you think that you're gonna go?